E a todas, nós vamos começar a sessão. Nós temos um convidado que não fala português, portanto eu vou passar a falar em inglês. Welcome to one more session of the cycles in political economy. This is a joint organization of the Department of Political Economy at ISCTE, of the PhD in Political Economy. We also have with us many of the students of the Master in Political Economy, and also it's a joint organization with the Portuguese Association for Political Economy. I'm very glad to have here with us Professor Giulio Palermo, who is a professor at the University of Brescia, where he has been teaching every time he can political economy, economic policy, theory of economic thought and economic history. And he has by now long work done on Marxist theory, on the debate between Marxist theory and other schools of thought, particularly Austrian economics and also new institutional economics. Giulio has also worked very much on the concepts of market and power, and I think that he has made very important contributions to the international debate on concepts of market and power. Maybe one day we will invite Giulio to talk about markets. Today we will focus mainly on power. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Giulio, and I want to say to Giulio that it's really a pleasure to have you with us today, and I hope this is just the first of more experiences in the near future. Thank you. You have the floor. So we are being watched not only. Besides the people we have here in the room, we are being followed by some other PhD students on Zoom, and then this is also being streaming to through YouTube. I don't know exactly how many people are following us on YouTube today, but in any case, I will ask you to take into account that people are following me through that camera. So I know you will probably forget, and I will raise my hand sometimes to make sure that all people are watching you.
I try to stay seated.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, Giulio. The floor is yours.
Okay. No, I can. So thank you a lot for the invitation. If you just put
this one. Okay. Okay.
I think you hear me without microphone.
Okay.
So thank you a lot for being here. Thank Ricardo for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to discuss with you. So I know that we have different scientific background here. I cannot assume that all of you know about economics and about the way academics deals with economics. So I'll try to stay simple. When I'm not clear, just say you are not clear and ask the questions you need. So the debate we are going to focus on today is the debate on power. This is quite astonishing that in the economics debate, there is the question of power has been raised very lately. In the 70s of the last century, this debate began, and it is quite strange for me, because when I started studying economics, it was precisely because I thought that it was the first and the main way to understand power relation. For some reason, this is not like this, and for some reason, this is also because of the problem of market relations, which Ricardo was referring to before. In a way, as we will see, the question of power is strictly related to the way economic theories have been looking at market relations, about competition. And this is one of the big problems, because competition is very often taken as a natural thing, something that has always existed, is everlasting. So we don't really ask questions about competition. It's there. We don't need to explain it. And on the contrary, in economics, competition is very often taken as the explanatory mechanism. So in particular, during the classical period, everything was to be explained by means of competition. And this is what Marx really criticized about what he called bourgeois economics at that time, or even in some cases, vulgar economics. So there is a problem here, because in order to discuss about power, we must understand the relationship between power and competition, between power relations and market relations. So the fact that you are not really within the economic debate is surely a problem, but it's also to some extent a very nice thing, because you're not going to take many of the concepts of the basic notions of the economic discipline as given. So for you, maybe it's more natural to ask questions, to problematize things rather than to go and find the objects of the study. But anyway, the thing you should know is that mainstream economics, as we study today, is basically grounded on a particular model, an economic model, a mathematical model, which is the Barrasian model. Léon Barras was an economist, a French economist, and of the 80s, the late 80s. It was just after the Marxist period, after the classical political economy and the criticism, the critique of political economy that Marx developed. As you probably know, Marx's critique is not just an academic critique. It's a scientific critique with very political purposes, with very revolutionary implications. So one of the problems in the academia is that even if Marx, of course, for obvious reason, was never given the possibility to teach in the university, but his theory was very spread. And even if it was not hegemonic, not even in the worker movement, but it was something which scientifically was a real problem when the academicians had to defend this idea that capitalism is the best word, the idea of the Adam Smith that the invisible hand is something which regulates all individual relationships and for some reason goes in the right direction. So there is this attempt to ideologically defend the capitalist system. And all of a sudden, we have this criticism, which is even today is the most organic critique of political economy, and which to a large extent applies even to all the developments after Marx. So all this to say that the reason of the success of a Barrasian model is not because scientifically it asks good questions or answer properly the questions it asks. It's just because for many different reasons, it was very well received in the academia. So it's just a model which is not developing, is not even trying to answer the Marxist critique. It just says, okay, forget about everything that's been developed before. Now I define the economic problem like this. And the like this is that you have individual agents, and they start to interact one another because of their individual interests. So they mathematically, everybody is solving a mathematical problem of optimization of its goals. It's called utility maximization. So it's just a problem of mathematics. And so starting from this idea that individuals starting to interact, and he interacts with me, everybody's interacting with one another. What are we interacting? We are basically exchanging goods. So the idea is that in this model, we have perfect competition, the idea that all our relationships are regulated by competition. Then we will see what perfect competition is. But the idea is that there is no power relation simply because we are in competition with one another. And if I don't like the good he's selling, I can buy my good to her or from another person. And at the same time, if he finds that I'm not a good buyer, he can sell the buy to another. He can sell the good to another person. So this is the general approach of Barrasian model. This model has become even today, is the model that everybody is asked to teach in the course of microeconomics. And all the courses about economics, political economy, must start with this model. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on the internal problems of this model, because basically all this approach has been criticized in many different ways, but the most critical aspect is that it's not able to answer the questions it asks. Basically, in all the mathematical developments, the objective was to show that there is an equilibrium, because when we all sell and buy different goods. So the idea is that the general equilibrium model, which is the Varasian model, is that you have so many markets there are goods, and in every single market, there is a price of equilibrium. At this price of equilibrium, everybody's happy because he's maximizing his utility function, and I'm maximizing mine. So if everybody's maximizing, and if we have a price in which everybody's happy, there is no reason to move from this price. So this was the real question that Barras was asking. He was not able to answer. The answer came like 70, 80 years later, but it was a technically a good answer. Then the model had to show also that when, for some reason, the price is not the price at which we are all happy, it should try to explain how, by moving the price, we converge to the price at which everybody's happy. And this is, to some extent, the idea of the invisible hands of Adam Smith. Adam Smith says that the market price is what signals you what you have to do. So without giving a lot of information, you already know that you have to buy this because this is a good that you need at that price. It's good to buy, and you also know that if the price is very dear, you have to economize that good. You don't have to buy a lot of that because it's a scarce resource. So the problem was that you should also demonstrate that there is technically it's called the stability problem. When you're not in the equilibrium price, what are the factors, the forces that bring the system to the equilibrium price? And this is unfortunately the chapter in which it's not Marxist critique, it's not external critique. Classical economics couldn't demonstrate any theorems like this. So on the contrary, there are theorems that show that it is impossible to demonstrate this. So this should be just one reason to say, why are we still discussing about Barras? Why are we still discussing about the general equilibrium model? So from this point of view, all that I'm going to say should be taken and thrown away. It's basically useless because all this debate is just a complication it is adding to this Barrasian model. So all this introduction is to give you the limits of what we are going to do. We are not here in the first step trying to understand what power relations are. We are trying to understand how economics and how, to some extent, also political science and sociology can deal with this notion of power. Then, of course, if we want to have a proper answer to the question of power, once we know that this approach leads to nothing, we should go back to the critique of this approach, the critique of why maybe to start with this idea that the economy is nothing more than single individuals interacting and there is no general structure and all this. So once we start problematizing this and we move to different approaches, maybe we will more in condition to develop a deeper understanding of power relation. So, but all my first part, and basically I will deal mostly with the first step, and I will just give you some suggestion about how to move to the second problem. So as I was saying, the debate on power started in the 70s of last century, and it was not even a clear debate on power. The problem is that when you take the general equilibrium model, the Barrasian model, it is a model in which there is no firm. So the first problem is that when you try to compare the economic model with the economic reality you are living in, the first thing you say, but here you never talk about money, you never talk about the firm, you never talk about production. So they started questioning what is the nature of the firm. Again, this is a theoretical and academic question. It is not a real question. If I ask you what is a firm, you don't have to go to the general equilibrium model and say, yeah, in that model, there is no firm. So let's try to understand, starting from this model, how reality is a bit different from the model. You just go out and you say there is a firm because there are people working there, they are producing goods. So you can define a firm with very different features, but basically a firm has to produce. So this is the first thing that the general equilibrium model cannot grasp, because it's a model of exchange. He's buying goods and selling goods, but where these goods come from? So no one asks this question. So from this, they also say, okay, but we must explain the nature of the firm because we have this model, and this is the model we are presenting to explain capitalism. So where are the institutions of capitalism in this model? There is only the market. The market is surely an important institution in capitalism, but it's not the only one. There are firms, there is the state, the firms can be multinationals. You can have very different configuration of the productive apparatus. So the problem is that they start asking, what is the firm? And the first answer that was given in a paper in 1937 by Ronald Coase, who, of course, for these very intelligent questions got the Nobel Prize, is the nature of the firm is because in the firm, there is a sort of authority in which there is a boss and there is a worker. So it's true that in the general equilibrium model, there is no real firm. But just because in that model, we always assume that competition is perfect. So if I don't like the good he's producing, I can buy the good from another person. So the relationship between two persons involves no authority, no power relation, just because you can go away and transact with another person. So his point is that within the firm, this kind of relation is abolished. In the firm, precisely because there is no possibility to go away from one person and go and find another situation which is for you irrelevant. It's not, you're not losing anything if you don't buy the good from him and you buy from her because they are selling exactly the same good. He said within the firm it's not like this. So it is because of this notion that within the firm there is a sort of authority. There is one person who says what the other person has to do that makes the firm different from the market. So here, even if it's not at first immediately clear, but Coase is doing two things. One is to say that there is no real perfect competition within the firm. The other thing is more delicate. He's saying that within the firm, we have not all the kind of conditions of the perfect market. That is to say, for instance, perfect information. For instance, the idea that everybody can maximize his utility function. If I want to maximize my utility function, I must know exactly all the possible alternatives. So you need a number of assumptions, which I call all this set of assumptions the decision-making context. You have a particular decision-making context, and then you have an organizational structure. The decision-making context is the set of definitions about, is there any uncertainty in the world? So when you define a model, first of all, is it a probabilistic model, or is a model in which probability does not exist? Then you must define the set of information. Yes, I can sell the good to him or to her, but am I sure that I know him or her? If I have limited information, maybe I don't know that she is interested in my good, but I don't know her. So in my decision-making problem, I don't take into account what she might do. So this is all what defines the decision-making context. You can define it in very different way. I can define a model in which there are asymmetric information. I don't know what she does, but I only know what the people in a range of 2 meters know. So you have a number of definitions about the decision-making context. And then when you define a model, you have a general, the organizational structure. The organizational structure is, for instance, in the general equilibrium model, I assume that there is no person commanding on another person. So I am assuming very horizontal relationships, and everybody can transact with everybody else. Within the firm, it's not like this. Within the firm, I have an organizational structure which is different, because all the people can interact with the boss. They cannot interact with them. They can interact with them only under the conditions imposed by the boss. So he problematized at the same time the decision-making context by saying it's not true that all the conditions of the general equilibrium model are true. At the same time, it's changing the organizational structure by saying within the firm, we have an organization which is different from purely horizontal. On the contrary, there are some vertical relationships in which I say to you what you have to do and you have to do. While doing this, of course, he's trying to explain the nature of the firm, but it's also making a big problem to the image of capitalism as a system in which all relationships are harmonious. There is no one who commands over another person. Because in this case, there is the boss and he's having authority over her. He's saying to her, you have to do this. Of course, she can say, no, I don't like our your orders, so I can go away. But when you go away, where do you go? Either to find another boss or to unemployment. But maybe you need the job. So there is this kind of asymmetry. And it's very problematic because on the one hand, is answering theoretically the questions, the abstract questions it asks. On the other hand, is not providing any image of capitalism as a system free from power relationships. So this is the reason why some 40 years later, this debate about power starts. So on the background, there is this debate on the firm. And the byproduct of this debate of the firm is that in the same way as you explain the firm, you are introducing power into the economic model. So the first reaction is in 1972 from two authors that published on absolutely the most important journals in economics, which is the American Economic Review. And it's a very silly paper. I mean, read it to believe it. I just quote what they say. They are basically trying to deny the existence of any power relation. I quote, this is Alken and Dempsey's 1972. It is common to see the firm characterized by power to settle issues by fiat, by authority, or by disciplinary action superior to that available in the conventional market. This is delusion. The firm does not own all of its inputs. It has no power of fiat, no authority, no disciplinary action, any different in the slightest degree from ordinary market, contracting between any two people. I can punish you only by withholding future business or by seeking redress in the course for any failure to honor our exchange agreement. That is exactly all that any employer can do. He can fire or sue just like I can fire my grocer by stopping purchases from his or sue him for delivering faulty products. So what they are saying is that basically the firm and the market are the same thing. It's true that in the market there is no power relationship, but they are saying, wait, who says that within the firm there are really power relationships? Basically, the relationship between the boss and the worker is exactly the same between a consumer and his grocer. If he doesn't like the product, he can just go and move away and find another seller. So this is the reason why this paper is so quoted. You will see I will quote many other people answering to this position. Is that ideologically it's very strong. They are saying power relations do not exist, not even in the firm. So to some extent they are taking the two things together. On the one hand, they continue to explain the firm in a way or another. And on the other hand, they are saying that this firm, with this condition, within this capitalist system, is no exception. There is no power relation, not even in it. We will see that this defense by Alken and Demsetz is to a large extent problematic, and it's very contradictory. But I think the best way to follow the debate is to see how within neoclassical economics, within mainstream economics, a number of economists have tried to answer this problem and try to show that it's not true that within the firm is exactly like within the market. Absolutely the most important author in this sense is Williamson, another Nobel Prize for a number of books, in particular one titled the Institutions of Capitalism, in which he tries to explain all the institutions of capitalism a bit like in the cause approach. So the idea is that you have like a Barrasian model, a general equilibrium model, and when the decision-making context is not like the Barrasian one, so when there are imperfections, remember from now onwards, this is the key word, imperfections. When there are imperfections, so the decision-making context is not perfect, there is not perfect information, there is not, there is some form of uncertainty, maybe someone is not able to maximize his problem, there are some sort of transactions costs. If you want to make a transaction, you must spend some money. So every time you have imperfections, you cannot solve the problem as in the Barrasian model. So Williamson made this exercise, which is first of all, let me quote him to say how he answers to Alken and Demsetz. The argument that the firm has no power of fiat, no authority, no disciplinary action, any different in the slightest degree from ordinary market contracting, here is quoting Alken and Demsetz, is exactly wrong. Firms cannot do exercise fiat and that markets cannot. So he's in open polemics against the other authors, and during all this discussion I'm having with you, my real goal is not to show that one is better than the other. My real goal is to show you that they are all agreeing to the same conception, and what they are discussing on are very secondary stuff. But the conception is the same, so my conclusion will be that even if now I need to go and particularize all these positions, we will see that they basically agree on the same conception, and the problem is that this conception is untenable. So this is why at the beginning I was anticipating that then we probably need to go and move to other approaches that are more consistent and more able to answer this kind of questions. So the approach of Williamson is very important because he develops cause problem in a very systematic way. He starts with the assumptions that in the beginning there were markets. So in a way, in the beginning, there is a general Barrasian, general equilibrium model in which everybody is exchanging on the basis of a perfect decision-making context and on a basis of perfect competition. Then he starts introducing some imperfection. Like for instance, there is not perfect information. So as I was saying, maybe I can interact with some of you, but I don't even know there are other people on the other side that might be interested in buying my goods or something like this. He introduced the assumption that the individuals might be opportunists. So when you sign a contract, are you so sure that you will then implement your contract? If there is no enforcer that forces you to do what you have signed in, maybe at some point you want to do something different. Just because you are optimizing your utility function. Before signing the contract, I would say that I will be a clever worker. As soon as I have signed the contract, I start working slow and all this kind of stuff. Of course, even in this case, opportunism is always on the side of workers. We have never been considering the kind of opportunism from the capital side. So he's going back to cause with a more systematic approach in which he, by making explicit all these different assumptions which define the decision-making context, he can say in every single case if the market is more efficient than some hierarchical form. So his conclusion is that if today we see that there are market, but there are also the firms, there are different kinds of firms, there are firms with hierarchical structure or even international structure and all this. It's because in a way or another, in that decision-making context, that kind of organizational structure is the best one. So here you have also another problematic aspect, because he's translating an exercise of comparing two different systems. He's interpreting this as the course of history. So he's saying, if this is efficient, the world will go like this. Of course, then it becomes tautological to say that we are living in the best world, because we are defining efficiency as the engine of history. Anyway, if we stay to the abstract problem we have defined, he's basically solving the problem. What is the nature of the firm? The nature of the firm depends on all these kind of imperfections we have in the decision-making context. So according to the kind of imperfection, we will have a particular kind of firms, and he pretends to do something very systematical. So he also pretends to explain the nature of the state, the nature of any capitalist institution. I love particularly this guy because I wrote a paper on the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which is called Anti-Williamson. And it is, the idea is that when I was reading Engels' Anti-Düring, I thought that really you can just copy-paste the Anti-Düring and apply to Williamson, and just erase Düring and apply to Williamson. And the ridiculous thing is that there has not been any attempt from all this development of bourgeois economics to answer the Marxist critique. So it's paradoxical, because many of the things that we can consider as dated, because of course Engels was criticizing Düring, Düring at a particular conception, which is the bourgeois one. He couldn't insist on the general equilibrium model because this model didn't exist. But this idea that economics has to do kind of things like this idea that everybody, all the institutions develop because we agree that it is nice to develop such an institution. There is no violence, there is no coercion. This is a very ancient idea. It's the beginning of political economy. So the exercise in Anti-Williamson is exactly to develop the main kind of arguments that Marx and Engels developed against the political economy of that time, against one of the leaders of this new approach, which is called New Institutional Economics. And after 5 years of my paper, he got the Nobel Prize. I thought that I should deserve it, but they preferred to give it to the guy. I moved to another approach, which is very close to the Williamson's one, which is the approach of property rights. This is an approach which explicitly takes inspiration from the first approach I mentioned, the one of Alken and Dempsey. So as them, he takes the market relations are natural, you don't have to explain them. But at the same time, it goes like Williamson and they try to problematize the decision-making context by saying, in fact, there are not really, there is no real perfection. There are some imperfections in the decision-making context, and in this way, like Williamson, they pretend to make a systematic way of analysis to see which is the best solution according to any kind of imperfection. They are a bit different from Williamson, but first of all, let's see how they need to answer the Alken and Dempsey's problem. And as Moore put it, a boss exerts authority over workers because in the event of a dispute, he can deny access to important physical assets. When a customer fires Alken and Dempsey's grocer, the grocer, being a separate contractor, gets to keep the store. Whereas if the grocer were an employee of the customer, the boss, could deny the grocer, the worker, access to the store and could hire another grocer on the spot labor market. So they're saying property rights matter. It's not just an issue of what kind of imperfections exist. They're saying that according to the imperfections that exist, it might be better that I employ him, or might be better that he employs me. But anyway, one employs the other. So there is an asymmetry. So they are moving a bit far from Williamson, because Williamson was simply saying it is an efficiency issue. If it is efficient that the world will go like this, the world will go like this. So if it is efficient that a firm solves part of the economic problem, it's normal that the firm will arise and the firm will develop. Here they are saying something more precise. They are saying that there is one guy who has more interest than the other in acquiring, in being the boss over the other. And let me try to explain why. They are saying that basically you have two different rights. You have when you define a contract, you have a number of things that you can precisely define in the contract. I can say you have to do this, this, and this. Then there are all these elements of imperfection. So maybe, and what about if tomorrow this is a natural catastrophe and we didn't write it on the contract? So what will be my duties? What will be your rights? And he's saying in this case, all the things that are not defined in this contract is what they call the residual rights. And the residual rights belong to the guy who has property. So if I hire you, if I am the grocer and you are the customer, I have the rights. Even if you are not my employer, these assets are mine. I have the property of these assets. So the property rights on an asset confers you the last words on that asset. And if you don't like it, you can go away, but you cannot fire me. So this is the reason of the asymmetry. But notice that even if we are getting closer to what we feel day by day, because in fact, property rights matter. Whoever do not have know very well that property rights are important. But at the same time, why do they matter? Because of imperfection. If you live in a perfect world in which there is no uncertainty, there is no imperfection in information and all this, property rights do not matter. Exactly like in the Varrosean model, it is indifferent if he hires me or I hire him. Notice that all these approaches that I have mentioned are really coming from the problem of the nature of the firm. So they are trying to all prices to explain power within the firm. But they all take for granted that outside the firm there is no power. So the market is taken as the benchmark of power-free relationship. If you have to explain the market, if you have to explain power, you must go out of the market and, for instance, enter a firm, enter the state with all its bureaucratic apparatus, which for neoliberalism is the source of all the problems and all this kind of stuff. So power is not within the market, maybe in other kinds of economic institutions of capitalism. And here, the two heroes of the '68 movement in the United States, Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis, come and make another step in the attempt to explain what power relations are. And their thesis is that, in fact, it's not true. You cannot take for granted that markets are free from power relationships. And their goal is to explain that power exists also within the market. I'm making a bit fun of them because historically their role was very important during the '68 movement. They are the leader of the so-called radical school. And the radical school was very influential in the academic debate. I'm not sure that it was really heard in the streets where there were demonstrations and all this, but academically it's very important. And the problem is that when you're a student and when you try to find who are the goods and who are the bads, these are the best you can meet. Their attempt, however, is an attempt to not to understand the real world. It's once again, the problem of explaining something which is not present in the model, but they see that it's present in the real world. So they try to put it in the model. But the basic model, their model is explicitly called post-Walrasian model. So they take the Walrasian model and they say, now we problematize it. And what do? They introduce imperfection. So they say, when the market is imperfect, you cannot say that it's so easy for me to go away from the relationship with him and go to a relationship with her. Because if the market is imperfect, maybe that it is costly for me to abandon a relationship and to find another one. And in particular, what they define this concept, I mean, we didn't need them. Political economy is much ancient. But they defined a short side of the market and the long side of the market. Every time the market is not in equilibrium, so there is not this price that makes everybody happy, it means that there are somebody which is not happy. Take the case of unemployment. All the potential workers would like to work, but employers are assuming only 80 out of 100 potential workers. So you have 20 people that would like to work, but they never work, they never job. So in this case, the long side is the side of unemployed, and the short side is the side that can decide. I can take this and not the other one. I need 80, I don't need 100. If you are in this case and you are a worker, you know that if you don't like your boss, it's not true that you say, bye-bye, I'm going to find another boss. Because maybe I don't find another boss. So in this case, I have power over you in the sense that I can, if I fire you, for me it's the same because I will find another worker. But you don't have power over me because in this case, you will go to unemployment, and we are assuming that in your utility function, unemployment is worse than having a job. I'm not going into all, I mean, these are the authors. Williamson was a master. Not to criticize Williamson is impossible, but Bolz and Gintis are the authors that I focus with more carefully because they are very dangerous politically. And the reason is that they make a very bizarre method. They pretend to appear as almost Marxists. They define them as neo-Marxists. But at the same time, they're not taking any of the categories of Marx. Marx doesn't start capital with, in the beginning there were markets and there were individuals. Marx starts capital with the commodity. The commodity is a particular cell of the capitalist system, which contains all the difficulties, the contradiction, the social relationship of the way we produce this commodity. So the first thing Marx is looking at how we produce and what we produce. We produce commodity. What is the commodity? It's not a person. In this case, we don't care. Commodities do not exist. Social relationships do not exist. Exists what is called methodological individualism. So the idea is that and this is the method which is unanimously followed within economics. Every scientific proposition, according to this method, can be explained starting from the individuals. So you have individuals, and when they interact, they can form a firm. Then they can form a state, or they can form some sort of power relationship within the firm, within the state, or within the market. So their idea is that, to some extent, you can replicate something that appears as Marxist. The fact that there is power relationship of one agent over another, but how do they obtain this proposition? By following methodological individualism. So they, as we can see, it's true that they can show that there is power within the market. But look at the way, for instance, at the boss-worker relationship. If I have to do something, if the workers in the example I've given to you before doesn't like unemployment and prefer to have a job, in Bolsonaro model is a consequence of the imperfections in the decision-making context. And in particular, the fact that, as I was saying before, when we sign the contract, you sign that you will work for 10 hours, and I will sign that I will give you 10 euros. We sign the contract, then I'm staying here, looking you at working and waiting for the profits you have to give me, but you start working too slow. And you have the information is in favor of you because you know how to work. I don't know how to work. I can assume a monitor who watches at you and says you are going too slow. But in some cases, in particular, when you have skilled workers, who can control the skilled worker? So if the skilled worker is taking a break, or is just going too slow, it's not making they formalize this notion of effort. It's not making the maximum effort I was expecting. He has, in a sense, an advantage over me. So how can I do to force him to maximize his effort? I just pay you, they call it an employment rent. So the worker becomes the guy who receives a rent. Even words have a meaning. The worker is the person that receives the rent, not the wage. What is this rent? The fact that I am paying you a higher wage so that if you lose the job, you find a worse condition. So I create a condition, a contract in which you are a privileged worker because you have asymmetric information. So basically you are stronger than me. But thanks to this strategy that I can pay you a higher wage, then I have power over you. Because if you don't do like I do, like I want, the day in which I find this out, I just fire you. And for you, this is a very bad thing. So you are losing something. So every time you lose something, I have power over you. But notice that they have to do this very contradictory stuff. They are saying that at the beginning, the asymmetric information is in favor of the worker. And because of this, the boss has power over the worker, which basically suggests me that this person have never entered a factory and seen why the worker obeys to the boss. And in this sense, it's very dangerous because even the conclusion they reach is surely a conclusion very strong ideologically because they can present themselves as the radical. They are so radical that we can show that if the problem of power relation is not confined within the firm, it exists in all capitalist relationships. And this notion of imperfection is very powerful from this point of view because they can show that the problem is not only when you have a worker and the boss, it's all every time you have transactions within imperfect decision-making context. So they apply this to the lender-borrower, to international relationship, to gender relationship. And every time people are happy because they say, oh, he's showing that, in fact, men have power over women. This is what I see. But why? Because there is an imperfection. And generally, the imperfection is because women have better information, so men find a way to exploit this information against women. There is another author that I mentioned in the paper I circulated, but I think I jumped it because maybe we have more important stuff to discuss. I just give you the idea. It's called Goldberg. He's another genius of building bridges between different theories. And his idea is that he wants to put together the Marxist approach and the neo-institutionalist approach. So he takes Williamson as the main figure of neo-institutionalism, and he tries to build a bridge with another author which is important in the Marxist literature, which is Richard Edwards. Of course, in order to do this, you must read Edwards, which is a very good Marxist, by the way, in terms of his categories. So Edwards is following Marx, saying that the asymmetry is because the worker, perfection or imperfection, no matter, is selling his labor power. So when the boss buys the labor power, then for all the period of the contract, he has power to decide what the worker has to do. This is in very few words what Edwards is saying by extrapolating from Marx. In the eyes of Goldberg, the problem is that for Edwards, the problem of this power relation stems from the fact that there are imperfections in the decision-making context. So when you sell your labor power, you sell it, like in the case of Boltz and Greenpeace and Property Rights School and all this, in some imperfect conditions. So you cannot enforce the contract at zero cost. And from this, he develops the asymmetry in which he too pretends to explain the power relations of capitalism. Is it almost 1 hour? How much time do I have? Can I continue like another 2 or 3 hours?
At least. I would say 15 minutes is fine.
Okay. Let us try to make a synthesis of all this. And
Sure.
I didn't.
Here.
Okay, so the idea is this. Basically, all these people see the sphere of economic relations of capitalism like divided in two parts. On the one side, you have all that belongs to something which resemble the perfect decision-making context. All the contexts in which you have which asymmetric information is not important, in which people are effectively solving their optimization problems. There is no uncertainty. There is no problem of all the problems that I have mentioned. Is the perfect decision-making context. Then on the other side, you have the imperfect decision-making context. Notice that this is the decision-making context, and then you can define different organizational structure within this decision-making context. Here, no one raises one of the questions which was the beginning of my investigation. Because my goal was to, when I started taking a model and separating into these two different notions, decision-making context and organizational structure, my goal was real to understand what is the best organizational structure in any decision-making context. So this is also the reason why Ricardo mentioned the fact that I've been working a lot on Austrian economics, because Austrian economics was the main bourgeois theory which was criticizing planning. There is this huge debate which changed the world in the academia, but no one cares about it, which is the debate on socialist planning. It is a very strong debate because the debate starts developing when the Soviet Union starts planning. So the real problem is that on the West, you have all these economic theories that are saying planning is irrational, planning is impossible, planning will go nowhere. And all of a sudden, you have the Great Depression in the West, and they start making 5 years plan in the Soviet Union. And they transform in 5 years plan, they transform the country. So if you think at all this problem of organizational structure, these guys are trying to explain the firm because of imperfections, but no one is really asking why, if this kind of planning within the firm is better than the market, why at the same time you are criticizing the socialist planning? So you have this contradiction. I was starting working on all these guys I mentioned, and on the other side I was working on Hayek, Mises, all the great Austrian economists against planning. And the point is that when I was doing this, all these guys were converging on the same thing. So within the new institutional economics, the real project is to make all this compatible. So they take some pieces of Austrian theory, some pieces of Williamson, some pieces, and they think they try to combine all of this. And for me, and I was trying to do something like this, but there was a problem. How can you try to put this together if one is saying that planning is absolutely impossible? This is Austrian economics. And you say that Hayek is compatible with Williamson, with Coase. They are saying that planning is better than the market. So this approach that tries to combine this is very contradictory from the beginning, because they pretend to change the decision-making context without questioning within each decision-making context which is the best organizational structure. So I did this. I took the Varasian model, and I just looked at the decision-making context of the Varasian model. And there is a very important result, which of course is not, even in this case, you have Nobel Prize. And in particular, you have the person that I'm going to talk to is the only person in the world that won the Lenin Prize in the Soviet Union and the Nobel Prize in the West. Is Kantorovich. Kantorovich was a mathematician that took like a sort of perfect decision-making context. He didn't absolutely care about the Varasian model, but he defines a model of perfect planning with the same condition on the perfect decision-making context. And he shows that this model of planning can do at least what the general equilibrium model can do, but can do much more. So the first thing I thought, why? If you really want to understand the world starting from the general equilibrium model, which is absurd anyway, but if you really want to follow this path, why don't you recognize that within the perfect decision-making context, you are not forced to assume perfect competition. So you are not forced to assume the market. You can have a perfect planning system without any market relationship, and it would work at least as good as this one. So this is the first problem, which only remained in my mind and in some paper like the anti-Williamson one. But all this approach doesn't even think at this kind of problem. So they all assume that when you are in the perfect decision-making context, competition will be naturally chosen. And this is very ideological, because it is like when I mentioned the Williamson and his assumption in the beginning there were markets. He could assume in the beginning there was central planning before starting doing these exercises. And Williamson is not stupid. He says it. He says, of course I could do this, but basically it's the same, because anyway, you can start from there or from there, but if one thing is more efficient than the other, you will converge to this. And ideologically, it's very strong. Anyway, you can start from socialism or from completely market relation. What you will have is multinational, vertical integration, and all this kind of stuff. So the exercise all these approaches do is that on the one hand, you have the perfect decision-making context in which perfect market relation will arise. And all this kind of imperfect decision-making context in which you can have power theories which can be within the firm or even within the market. So the second step is to try to put the author I mentioned on this diagram. So let's imagine that, now let me say once more on this one. This is the borderline between perfect and imperfect. Imagine that the borderline is here. So everything is imperfect, and the perfect decision-making context is the nil set. In this case, you have all these kind of theories in which explain power relationships and which says that, in fact, a system without power relationship does not exist. Here, the best author is Ernesto Screpanti, an Italian guy who says he's a follower of Boltzmann-Gintis. And Boltzmann-Gintis, as I mentioned before, say that power relations are almost everywhere, but they recognize that sometimes, if the market is perfect, in that particular piece of reality, there is no power relation. Ernesto Screpanti, a radical, the most radical, says no. When we discuss about the Varasian model, it's only because we take it as the model that does not exist. We look at it to understand what does not exist. But the reality is that power relations are everywhere, because all these imperfections are everywhere. So he says, this is just a theoretical exercise. We take it as a benchmark, just as a negative benchmark, but we know that it is not like this. Of course, he doesn't even contemplate the idea that why do you start with something which does not exist rather than starting from what you want to explain? But this is all another stuff. So here you have Screpanti, Bolzan-Gintis, and all this. If you put this borderline here, so everything is perfect, you compress the imperfect decision-making context and you expand the perfect decision-making context. Here you have Walras. This is the Walrasian model. All the world is perfect decision-making context. All the world is perfect competition. So I try to put this, these different authors here. And of course, in the extreme right, we don't have only Walras. We have also Alken and Demsets, which says, yes, it's true. The firm is not like the market. But even within the firm, even if it's not a market, everything works as if it was a market. So these are the extreme right. Then you have these different, these are the property rights school. This is Goldberg, this is my friend Williamson. All these are in the middle. And these guys are basically making coincide the notion of power with the notion of the firm. So for them, if it's here, there, or into another point of this line, it's just because the organization within the perfect decision-making context takes these sides. Then you have Bolzan-Gintis. They say, no, it's almost everywhere. It's not clear if when they say almost everywhere, it's like it is necessarily everywhere or not. And the limit case is Screpanti. You can put it here because it's the only one so explicit to say, no, basically, we start from the Walrasian model, but just because we don't care about it. The real problem is another one. So this is the end for me of my internal critique. How do I put it again, my face?
There, stop sharing. It's red, right.
You do it. You are my assistant. So
You have the power.
I got the power. This is basically the end of my internal critique, in the sense that I have managed to put on the same line all these different authors which are debating with very harsh tones and making polemics very deep. And my conclusion is that this is a very flat ontology in which you have reality is just economic relationships, and what makes the relation different from another is just if it involves imperfections or not. Of course, I think we have never thought that imperfections in the real world were like the cause of capitalism. But in this approach, everything depends on imperfection. So this is basically the reason why you cannot go very far if you start with this model. So let us start to make some points that may help us to go in the right direction. First of all, let me stay one minute more on the internal criticism. The idea that imperfections are the cause of something means that capitalism is not the historical product of feudalism or other kinds of model production. It is because of imperfection. So before capitalism, there was not feudalism, there was Leon Barras. There was the model of this guy. If you want to explain capitalism, you need this model. So this raises another very bizarre contradiction, because all these people that pretend to be specialists about power in capitalism had to wait that capitalism was so developed to produce a man who one day developed a model in which, the Walrasian model, you define the perfect decision-making context, and only from this point onward, you can make this exercise of introducing imperfection. So before the Walrasian model, if you wanted to study power relation, you were fucked. There was no way to do it because you didn't have the negative benchmark. So in a way, they also must consider themselves very lucky that they put the question of power just after, some century after the development of the Walrasian model. There is, of course, now I want to go a bit toward Marxism. And Marx didn't only start by the commodity. He spent all his life with this idea that in order to understand capitalism, you must understand three different things. First of all, production, then circulation, and then put the two things together. You cannot do otherwise. And Marx spent all his critique of bourgeoisie economics and vulgar economics by taking the author, the economist, that pretended to discuss circulation without having understood production. It is not by chance. Capital, many people read Capital like if it's Star Wars, you have the first movie, then you have the second, and like a trilogy. It is a very organic work. You must start from production because first of all, Marx wants to explain all the categories he's developing. So he must explain the origins of surplus value. You must explain where profit comes from. But if you start looking at profit, you don't see it. Because profit is already something which is the result of production, but also circulation. Profit is the money that the capitalist gets into the pocket. How? Because he's selling the commodity after having exploited the workers. So he spent the whole volume 1 to explain how, without recurring to competition and to the market, the surplus value of the worker is at the origin of the profit of the capitalist. After having done this, in volume 2, it goes to circulation. So he put all these results aside for a moment, and he tries to understand what basically vulgar economists and bourgeois economists do. Let's see what happens in the market. When you see what happens in the market, and you already know that what is being exchanged in the market there is no production of value. So of course, if he sells me a commodity and I sell to her, if I sell the commodity at its true value, I cannot have anything for me. So the profit cannot be created in circulation. It must come from production. And when you try to explain circulation, profit, you already know that this profit is not even called profit because profit is when you start exchanging it, but cannot be created in this sphere. So you already know that some notions like exploitation, surplus value are created in production, and then you see what happens in circulation. When you put this together, you have a general understanding of capitalism. But basically, all these authors that start from the firm don't take the patience to read the first page of Capital. In Capital, it is very clear that the authority relationship of the boss over the worker is not because there is one boss and one worker. Because in production, the definition of the mode of the capitalist mode of production is that it is a class system. It's based on class relationships. It's not a single person interacting with another single person. It is a capitalist and the boss. And as Marx put it, you don't even have to ask them. You already see how they behave. Even when they are in circulation, one works in a certain way, the other works in another way. One is able to command, the other does not even know what it is. So even in circulation, you can understand that they have different roles. But in circulation, we are just exchanging something that has already been produced. It's in production that you can explain social classes. In circulation, there are no real social classes. When we go to the supermarket, even though this criticism, this anti-capitalist criticism of forms of struggle, they say like, we stop consuming this good. Yeah, you stop consuming this good. You stop spending your money. You pretend to change capitalism by means of a struggle in circulation, but you're not changing anything within the sphere of production. Marx says in production, you have social classes. And the authoritative relationship of the worker and the boss is because they belong to other social classes. So the moment that I sell my labor power, you have power over me, not just because if I go away, then it's costly, or because I have different information from you. It's just because I am a worker, I have no alternative. If I don't like a boss, I have to find another boss to work for. If I don't want to be exploited from him, I have to find another person who is willing to exploit me. And Marx says very explicitly, the worst thing that can happen to a worker is not to find any capitalist willing to exploit him. This is the worst condition. This is not the Eden of neoclassical economics or Barrasian economics. When no one is exploiting you, is the real tragedy of the worker. So the necessary step to move towards Marxism and to understand this relationship between power relation and market relations is that you must first of all separate production and circulation. So this is an essential step, which in Marx's idea is very clear, and this is also very efficacious when you want to develop a criticism of bourgeois economics, because you see that they only discuss about circulation. Circulation in modern terms is exchanges, market relationships. The step forward that I did was to focus more on competition, because here it's not only a problem of market relation. So after this paper titled Power, a Marxist View, I wrote a paper which is Competition, a Marxist View. Because here the problem is that we are contrasting power and competition, the firm and the market. But we are basically not understanding what competition is. So you can take it as a negative benchmark, as a positive benchmark. It is a benchmark. Everything is explained from competition. This is exactly what Marx thought was wrong. Competition does not explain anything. Competition is the product, it's the other side of capital. And this is also the reason why in all volume 1 of Capital, competition is basically absent. If you look for the word competition, it appears like 4 or 5 times. And every time he mentions competition, he says, okay, I just mentioned it here because I needed to mention here, but I cannot develop this because competition belongs to the sphere of circulation. Competition, he says, is the real vehicle of the laws of capital. Capital as its law, the law of exploitation of one class over another, the law of making capital going to concentrate. So that the reason why we have multinational firms is not because there are imperfections, it's simply because it's one of the general laws of motion of capital that Marx explained. And how these market laws develop by means of competition. So basically, we also need to understand really the nature of competition if we want to understand the nature of power. And in the paper, Power, a Marxist View, I try to explain the role of power relationships as a subproduct of the consequences of exploitation in capitalism. Capitalism is a mode of production based on class relationships. Class relationships make exploitation possible. When you have exploitation, you must also need some mechanism that forces the exploited class to work for the exploited class. What is this mechanism? So this is the contrast between competition and power. It is precisely competition. And Marx defines competition as the external coercive mechanism of capital. This is the mechanism of capital, it's a coercing mechanism. Competition is not like the Eden in which everybody is free to do what he wants. Competition is exactly the opposite. Within a class system, within this class system based on capital, competition is precisely what forces everybody to do what capital needs. And it does not force only the worker, it forces capitalists In Capital, Marx does not really care, it might seem paradoxical, but he's not looking at competition between workers. He's looking at competition between capitals. It is the fact that capital altogether has a certain dynamics, which makes necessary also to explain how the single pieces of this capital altogether are interacting with each other. And he finds that the way is competition. So the reason why capital concentrate, so basically competitive markets becomes impossible. It's precisely because of competition. Because I compete with him, I compete with everybody's competing. And when you are competing, what are you doing? You are trying to introduce innovation. You are facilitating concentration of capital. The big fish is the small fish, or they find an agreement and they make a big fish together and they just merge their firms. They merge their firms. So the concentration of capital, which is the abolition in a sense of competition as a market form, is precisely the result of competition as a coercive mechanism. So even when we talk about competition, and in all this that I am trying to discuss with you today, you've seen competition is the opposite of power. When you go deeper and try to understand power as a source of the mechanism of capitalism, you understand that these power relations are basically the same thing of this vehicle of capitalist exploitation, which is competition. So competition as a coercive mechanism is something which is really at the opposite of this conception. So even this author that pretends to come to conclusion which resembles a bit what Marx was saying, they are playing with words. They are taking competition as the neoclassical economists do. They are taking power as the neoclassical economists do. But they are not understanding neither competition or power. The real problem is that once you follow the historical development of capitalism and you try to understand the essential categories of capitalism, the first thing you must ask, what is real and what is not? It's not an issue of imperfections. And here I find Marx very useful because Marx is, had this need to, in building capital, also to replicate to all the bourgeois economics. So at his period, like now, everything is because of competition. So he does this exercise, which is very, very useful, even for us, to say, let's put competition aside. How can we explain capitalism? What are the essential categories? First of all, social classes. If you don't have social classes, you don't have a labor market. So what is capitalism? It's a mode of production. It's not an exchange system. Of course, markets pre-existed capitalism, but capitalism is something more than a market system. When today we define our economy like a market system, what is a market system? The market existed even in ancient Rome or in ancient Greece. You can have markets for slaves. You can have markets for any kind of commodities. But a mode of production is something different. Is the way you produce through the market because of the market. You are not producing a good and then you exchange in the market. You are producing good because you need to exchange to the market. You are not producing the good you need. During the feudal era, there were markets, but the peasant was first of all working for what he needs and for his family, and then for the feudal lord. There was no market relations in this. The excess over this production could be selling in the markets for international commerce and all this. But first of all, you had to satisfy the general needs of population. So this was a mode of production which didn't really rely on markets, but markets existed. So the point is not if you live in a market society or not. Markets have a long history which is much ancient than capitalism. The problem is that during this period in which markets start to develop, at some point you have a qualitative change. The fact that a proper labor market in which people lose their means of production. So class relationships are the fact also that you don't have your means of production. Marx called it the divorce of the worker from his means of production. When you don't have your means of production, what you can do? You can sell your labor power. So this idea that we are free, Marx says we are free in a double sense. We are free in the sense that we can dispose of our labor power as we want, but we are also free in the sense that we have been deprived of all the means of production. So in a sense, we are free, but we are forced to sell the labor power. So if you don't grasp these two elements of the development of capitalism, which even at an individual level are the product of the change in the social classes configuration. If you don't grasp this, of course, you remain at the level in which you have the hunter and the fisher that exchange their goods, but you don't even ask the question why one is a hunter, one is a fisher. And of course, you cannot explain why one is going to the factory working for 10 hours and the other guy is making profits out of this. So all these different steps are the steps that I think allow to understand, to answer the questions that all this debate have raised in a more realistic and convincing and coherent way. This is not to say that all this debate is useless. This debate helps us to understand how the bourgeoisie see the reality. This is one of the strong aspects of Marxian critique. When he talks about appearances and essence, basically all the ontology I described was an ontology of appearances. You see a particular market is perfect or is imperfect. Is there perfection or is there imperfection? We are not supposing that there is any underlying mechanism that maybe you cannot see, but is governing all these appearances. When Marx talks about essence and appearances, he's not saying that the appearances are wrong. He's saying that it is just a part of the story. There is another part of the story that you cannot see directly. And the work of the economist, the work of the scientist, is not to rationalize the appearances and say, oh, look, everything is nice, everything is coherent. It's to understand that these appearances are basically what you can see about what is moving all these appearances. So the ontology of Marx is a more articulated one, it's a stratified one in which you have essence, which is governing the appearances. But at the same time, it's also very important to understand how things appear. If capitalism is a mystified system, it's not because the guys I have mentioned are a servant of power. Well, to some extent they are. But this is not a problem. They do their job. The problem is that they see the problem like this, because once you are in the system, and once you think you take the appearances as all you have to explain, all that exists, of course you cannot do anything but playing with appearances. So if you want to explain the power relationship of the boss over the worker, you must assume that the imperfection at the beginning is in the worker. So in the exchange between the two, the boss can pay something and reinverse the power relation. In the exchange, there can be no creation of value. You are in the sphere of appearances. But this sphere of appearances is moved from mechanisms that are the essence of the capitalist model production. And this essence is made of exploitation. You cannot see exploitation. Exploitation is not an individual, an interpersonal relationship. When people say, oh, so you are saying that no, let me put this together. Wait. But the idea that you provocatively can say, so you define yourself as exploited by your employer. You cannot put it this way. I am not exploited by the person. I am a person exploited by a class. I am the personification of a class exploited by another class. Of course, it will be an individual capitalist who will exploit an individual worker. But the individual worker is basically the property of the entire capitalist class. So once you move from this flat ontology and you understand that things are a bit more complicated, there is an essence and there is an appearance. To understand the appearance is part of the game. Of course, if you want to do it in an efficacious way, And in particular, if you want to do it because you want to change the world, so you want to intervene in this world in which people see the problems as they appear, you must really understand, first of all, how things are going at the underlying level, but also how people see this level. Because they don't see that. We cannot be all scientists. So basically what Marx reproached to vulgar economists is that they pretend to rationalize the appearance and to say that everything is fine. And they don't understand that there is something behind. But this is, at the same time, he says they cannot do otherwise, because the only way to move from this position is to investigate the essence. So you cannot just start from circulation, because capitalism is not a market system. First of all, you must ask you the question, what is this system? Not what is this interpersonal relationship. And going back from the issue of methodological individualism that I mentioned at the beginning, we can see that this is the real problem. The idea that every scientific proposition in social sciences can be the product of an explanation which starts from the individual. This is put like a methodological question. So you cannot even raise criticism, because this is the methodological starting point. And if you don't follow this method, you don't get published. If you don't follow this method, you are not a rigorous scientific, a rigorous economist. So the paradox is that even macroeconomics, the Keynesian economics, now, in order to be scientific, needs to be microfunded. So this idea that everything has to be explained from the individual is transforming vulgar economics into science. What Marx was making fun of vulgar economics, saying you are just doing Robinsonade. You have Robinson Crusoe on the island, and you pretend to, from this, to develop a theory of capitalism. He was making fun of this idea, has become the scientific method. If you don't follow this method, this is not scientific. And basically what I am trying to argue today is that this is exactly the method that brings you to this kind of conception, in which you will never be able to reintroduce the essence of the problems you pretend to explain. I think I better stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for some questions. Also, the people that are online, they should feel free to. Não percebi? Não, mas you know. Para. Ok. Achas que não posso partir isto simplesmente? Okay. So, questions. You might want to sit down. I brought you some more. Questions? Remarks? Who wants to start?
Critique.
I have a question that it's not directly related to the presentation that you made, but
Can I?
yeah.
Well, thank you.
But how difficult, I mean, what I'm trying to ask is, are you an alien in Italian academia? Like how difficult, an alien in Italian academia, like how difficult is it to publish like this sort of, how is your theory accepted in Italian academia, or how difficult is it to teach classes? I'm sorry.
I just but basically I'm not allowed to teach.
Oh.
I have this is I mean, I don't want to go into personal stuff because you probably not interested. I have nothing to hide, but the problem is that one problem is Marxism.
Yeah.
The other problem is that it's academic Marxism, because Marx was not an academic, was a revolutionary. So the point is that he needed, he was like, I don't know, he had a brain like this, and he thought he could live like 400 years. When you see his research project, it's huge. Capital was just a part of it. And his idea was that all this was useful to make the revolution, to explain scientifically the contradictions of capitalism and to show the way for another system. So this is absolutely anti-academic. And the problem is that when you today you make the, I am a bit embarrassed about this question because
I'm so sorry.
no, it's a very good question. I accept it. I
wrong.
accept it. But the point is that if you want to be a Marxist, an academic Marxist, you must do the job of the guys I've mentioned. But both Sapientis are the heroes of students. Both Sapientis have never been in contact with the working class. They, even the idea that they accepted methodological individualism as a way to show mainstream economics, look, we are so clever that we can play with your tools, with your game, and we will win anyway. For them to win was to have some formal proposition resembling a Marxist proposition. So this was the game. It's an academic game. When you try to study Marx and discuss it with people, I'm not even saying teaching Marx, I'm discussing about Marx with people that are interested in this. And you do this because actually you want to transform the world. It is an internal contradiction for the academy. This is not just Italy, this is all over the world. Basically, my scientific work has been, of course, I am an economist, I spent a lot of time, like Ricardo said, and I also wrote 2 books and a number of articles on the university, on the mechanisms of reproduction of the university. In Italy, but basically it's very similar. You have this problem that the university has to produce new culture, new scientific knowledge. But when you do it freely, the problem is that culture and knowledge can be really disgraceful for ideologically and politically for what it is. So in Italy we have Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci is an author which spent his life in prison, but he was really thinking that the work on changing the ideas could be a revolutionary part of the movement. Of course, you cannot expect that the system will accept you. Oh, you're very clever. You're published on the Cambridge Journal, one of the good journals. How did you do? I mean, maybe you can publish in international journals. This is a question of being rigorous, of being able to play the game of international publications without renouncing the goals you have. This is something you can do. Another thing is to be accepted from the colleagues when you make your struggles, when you behave coherently with what you write and what you think. So the point is not only we are in a class and we are discussing. Then maybe we go outside this class and there is a movement, there is a strike, there is a struggle. What do you do? If you are, now there is this dominant opinion is that teachers shouldn't do politics, neither in class nor outside the university. I think that we should do politics within the university and outside the university. And I have never expected to be accepted peacefully from this. So I have my scars on my skin.
First of all, I'm sorry for this.
No, but I think I think it's a question of coherence. You got to the point, because the problem of academic Marxism is really the contradiction of Marxism. And this is something which makes me very nervous when you see all these people that are self-proclaimed experts of Marx. But yes, when you sit down and then you go on the lecture, and if you have to teach about methodological individualism, you teach methodological individualism, not as the bullshit of the century, but as the method of being rigorous. So this is a question of coherence. The problem is that, for obvious reason, Marx will never be accepted as a mainstream university. And when it's accepted in heterodox universities, it's just because pluralism is nice. So you just have this, like when you're a panda, you have this kind of different animals. For the survival of the species, you need also Marxists. So it's like you have a feminist, you have a Marxist, Black Lives Matter, and all this. But of course, we remain racist, gender, sexist, and basically against.
I asked this question because your presentation was very impressive, and I've never been in contact with this sort of academia. This was totally new. And I also asked this because I wanted to ask you if you think that the debate on capitalism, if it's back. I mean, because I asked this because I recently read a paper by Nancy Fraser, and she starts the paper by saying capitalism is back. After decades of ignoring and just accepting capitalism, the academia is finally maybe starting to focus a little bit more on questioning it, etc. And I wanted to ask you if you think that's true.
The point is that we are in a fucking mess now.
Yeah.
And this is not because now you can say, oh, Marx was right. On Facebook you have those of these people. I told you I was right. The point is not just to see if capitalism is now questioned or not. The problem is that in this crisis in particular, which is we are all forced to have this mask on the face, which is part of repression, part of manipulation, part of terror, part of everything. It is just one aspect of this very last crisis. But the crisis of capitalism is in its producing mechanism. And to question capitalism is not a theoretical issue. It's a question of struggle. And the point is that the more capitalism is in crisis materially, so the more the material conditions for a real change, for a radical change, for a change in the mode of production are becoming absolutely present, the more we are not organized to make any step forward. The more we are struggling at the level of appearances. So we are not struggling scientifically. This is why I think Marx was very important when I was saying that he's not simply happy to understand how capitalism works. He wants also to explain how the bourgeois economists look at this, because the bourgeois economist is simply transferring into science what people see about this. The problem of capitalism is that it is a mystified system. It's a system in which, of course, the world knows that he is exploited. But what is exploitation? You need all this volume one capital to understand what is exploitation. So if you don't have a Marxist approach, which is the instrument of a struggle, it becomes very difficult. And the problem is today we don't read Marx. And when we read Marxists, like Piketty, that makes the capital of the 21st century, where is capitalism in that book? It's the most bourgeois economics book one could write. But he looks like a Marxist. In Greece, we have Varoufakis. Varoufakis said, I'm half Marxist. I do game theory, but I'm sympathetic with Marx. Sympathetic in the sense he likes the joke of Marx. Then he went to negotiate for the Greek people, and what he did, just was assuming that you have to pay the debt, you must respect the law of capital, you've been elected with the votes of the bank, so you must give something back to the banking system. So all these people that pretend to be Marxists basically are representing the bourgeois class. And do you think that we have now some Marxists that could really defend the interests of the working class? It's true that the system is going to collapse. It's going to collapse because the rate of profit is going down. You see entire sectors of the economy that are fat. But at the same time, look at the Nasdaq. It has never been at these levels. So something is happening. It's just a reconfiguration in this crisis of the sectors, of the nations, of the coalitions, which are taking all, and those are going to disappear. So now this is the kind of struggle we are witnessing now. And we are not understanding this. We are not using our scientific tools to respond to this. We must survive. If you don't put your mask, I don't know if you really are afraid of the coronavirus, or it's just because they're imposing on you. But many people just do it because you must do it. And when you do this, it's just the very last element of a very long process in which we have been disciplined by not really to the government that says put this because you're in danger. We have this discipline provided by in the working activity. We have the transformation of the work relation, in which now you take a taxi and there is just a platform in which no one is producing. The guy who earns more is the guy that doesn't produce. Or the sphere of circulation, which is not producing anything, but it's exactly the sphere which is coordinating all the workers all around the world. You take the Balmac, Carrefour, Nike, all the multinationals which produce a lot. They are not producing. They're just collecting producers all over the world, and they have the power to do this. So it's very difficult, I think, in this phase of capitalist development to develop the weapons against capital, because we don't have a clear understanding of capitalism. We are still thinking that the problem is the gender relationship, because it's obviously true that there is always a domination of men over women. But very often we discuss about this superficial aspect, and we don't identify or take immigration. We talk about the migrants, like if they were birds that going to migrate one way to another direction and then they go back to their place. They are workers. They are proletarian workers that are forced to move. We don't call them exploited workers. We call them migrants. So this is not just a question of terminology. This is an issue of incapability of understanding the class interest of the exploited class. So we think that young against old is a division of people by demography. Like if you can born old and I can born young, but it's not like this. We have all these divisions which have been introduced really to divide the proletarians. And even if we go to a class and start discussing about Marx, I mean, you can do the class and try to break some principles, but I know that it will never be from here that we will organize a workers' movement. And the problem is that when you try to interact with the workers' movement, you cannot assume that you can reconstruct a class ideology, a class consciousness so easily. We are losing and losing since decades. And the more capitalism crisis, the more the workers' movement is in crisis. So I'm not at all optimist, frankly, about the way things might change. Materially, all the conditions for a revolution are there. The real problem is the subjective element. We don't have an organization in which subjects can force on the contradiction of the system in order to do it. Then, of course, everybody does its job. You are likely that you have professors that spend their time trying to do something. But I don't see it so easy.
Okay. Let me just say something about your first question, your starting point, which is ultimately Giulio does have a position in the Italian university. It's a very conflictual one, but it took a lot of effort to get one. So it's a long story. We might tell you about that afterwards, but it's important to take this into account. He has published in top journals in this field of expertise, okay? And if he didn't have done this, he would never get the position he got. For me, this is quite clear, and I think this is not debatable. If you ask him if this was the funniest thing or the most useful thing that he done in his life, probably he will say no, because he wrote many other books that were very much influential. But still, first, he proved he could do it, and more important than that, he gave a contribution to scientific knowledge through that. Okay, so this is to say that you should not expect to, just because you publish in top journals, your life will be easy. It won't, but it's a necessary condition for you to do something in academia. Then what you choose to do outside academia is a different issue, and how you do it is a different issue. Okay, more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
A question about the market empowerment. We didn't focus on that specifically.
Yeah, film it.
But you did mention competition as an external coercive mechanism. I was wondering if you are, what are your views on the Marxist part of the labor managed firm and the idea of cooperatives, worker cooperatives as a new mode of production, but that still uses market as a form of coordination.
This is a very delicate question, and my answer will probably go in the opposite direction you expect. Marx discussed cooperative firms in different parts of capital. Most of them, he's discussing the way the capitalist class is getting rid of this ugly problem of monitoring and disciplining workers in the workplace. In more than one passage, he discusses cooperative firms in parallel with the development of I like the word the stock action. What do you call the
Stock market?
sorry?
Stock market?
In the stock market,
Public
there are
companies. Public companies.
not public.
Not public in the sense of state-owned, but in public in the sense that their shares are on the market.
Yeah.
Sociedades por ações.
Stock companies. I wanted to say stock companies, no more than this. So these are two examples in which the problem that also the bourgeois economists are discussing, the problem that once you are in a firm, you must discipline labor. So both Giuntis with their idea of the employment rent, they give you a wage higher so that you put all the effort. It's always a problem when you have to do with workers, because the workers can strike, can go on strike, can slow down the pace of work and do lots of things. This is basically, first of all, the reason why capitalists prefer to develop constant capital. So I have to do with machines which do lots of things and not with workers. But of course, you always need historically someone who coordinates the labor process. And this is historically at the beginning is the capitalism. I got the money, I buy your labor power, I buy the inputs, and then I say to you, now you combine these inputs, you work on this, and you make a table out of goods and other things. This is a problem for me. So every time the capitalist wants to get rid of this function, he develops different organizational forms. One of these is the cooperative firm. Within the cooperative firm, you have this problem that the workers are forced to self-exploit. Many, for instance, discrepanti, many of the authors I mentioned, even Bolsonaro, they are all fanatic of cooperative firms. I don't know how many of you have been working in a cooperative firm. The cooperative firm is the highest form of exploitation you can have nowadays, because very often it is just a result of the capitalistic firms that, for different reasons, prefer to externalize some functions to cooperative firms. So I don't have to take care of all the labor process. This part of the labor process is a cooperative firms that just guarantee me the result of the product. So just give me a part or make works, services, and whatever. So when you have a cooperative firm, you can have this impression that it is like a sort of small island within a notion of capitalist relationships. The problem is that the capitalist firm, the cooperative firm has to buy the inputs on the market and to sell the outputs on the market. And they don't decide the price. So they remains under the coercive force of capitalism, which is competition. And competition becomes the very disciplining factor against the workers of a cooperative firms. So apparently, and one thing is true, you don't have this authority, or at least authority within the cooperative is less strong, in the sense that the boss does not have all the power. There can be more democratic procedures of taking decisions and all this. At the same time, economically, you don't get rid of exploitation. Precisely because exploitation is not an interpersonal, it's not the capitalist, the individual capitalist who is exploiting his workers. It is the class of capitalists. So the day in which the cooperative firms have worked for 10 hours and you don't want to be exploited, so you think you will receive money which will allow you to buy products and commodities which contain 10 hours. The moment that the price of your commodity goes down, just because competition brings down your commodities, what you have to do, you are forced to exploit yourself much more than before. So you remain enslaved by this coercive mechanism of competition, even if apparently you get rid of it, because you are democratically deciding what to do, how to do, at what time we start working, and all this. But if you don't start working first, you don't get the same result of a capitalist firm. So finally, you must exploit yourself exactly in the same quantity of the exploitation you can see in a capitalist firm. And this is a problem because it's true that, in particular in the third volume of Capital, when Marx goes back to the cooperative firms, he's also trying to discuss how these developments of capital might lead to another kind of model production. But capital is about capitalism. It's not about socialism. It's discussing how the material things, even the stock firm, the stock company is the same thing. The fact that you have socialized everything, Marx says this is absolutely a necessary condition if you want to move to a planned system in which you are not producing just for making capital happy, but you are producing because you want to satisfy the needs of the people. So this is a necessary condition. But if you have just this condition, but then you don't have a revolutionary moment, this is the highest degree of exploitation, both in the stock company and in the cooperative firm. So you have this, I think that there is a general misunderstanding of this, because if you take capital a la carte, you can have this impression. Here he's discussing about socialism. So look, when he says that the associated workers can develop a different mode of production, he's not discussing, as I read it, the idea that we as workers associate and start a cooperative firm. He's discussing about a system, a mode of production based on associated workers. But if you associate workers within the capitalist system and you make a cooperative firm, you remain subject of all the forces of this system. And these forces exist independent of how you see them. So competition will remain in place. Once you have a socialist system, a communist system in which you think you produce water because people are thirsty, you produce medicine because people are sick and all this, you look at the needs, you look at what you can do to satisfy these needs, and then you don't allow competition. You give water to the thirsty guy, you don't make any competition between agents. Medicines will go to the people that are sick of that kind of a problem. So this is the way, once you abolish capital, you also abolish competition. And of course, there is no way you have to do it together. You must fight against competition and you must fight against capital. This is also one of the reasons I think it's very contradictory within the anti-capitalist movement. This part of movement that thinks competition as a way to change things. Competition is just the other side of capital. And to go back to your question, cooperative can get rid of the coordination within the firm, but we will never get rid of competition once they buy and sell their commodities. And they remain part of a system which is based on producing goods, producing commodities to be sold. Because the cooperative is not producing what workers need, it's producing a particular commodity which they have to sell. So they remain enslaved by the laws of the market in a way.
More questions?
Very brief one. I was wondering when you were presenting, which was very interesting, and congratulations for the presentation. When you were explaining how the issue of power has emerged in economics, and you situate the 1970s and the 20th century, I was wondering, because perhaps there are other contributions that we can see that they came from institutional economics, but not from new institutional economics. I was wondering, for instance, John Palmer, when you spoke about the inequality of bargaining power, and perhaps it's difficult to categorize him as someone who was just focused on uncertainty and departing from the Bauersian model. So, of course, we can call him a reformist, okay? He was trying to use institutions as a way to reduce inequality of bargaining power, like collective bargaining, the power of unions, the labor law. What do you think about that? Is this, of course, it's not Marxist, of course.
Yeah.
But it's different from the other one. So I would like.
I think you get the point. In the economic field, the issue of power comes from these people, Commons, Weber, the so-called old, now that we call them old institutionalists, just to make the difference with the new institutionalists. But they were the institutionalists, most of them American. There was Myrdal in Sweden. I think they were probably the best economists which were able to deal with the issue of power. And they were also very influential to some extent. Because if you think at all the antitrust legislation in the USA, which is not just a formal thing, the antitrust was really serious. And when they decided that they had to dismantle some monopoly, they were doing it seriously. So many of the debates within mainstream economics were just trying also to answer all this kind of contributions. Now, why I didn't spend much time on them? Of course, not because they're not relevant. They are absolutely relevant, and I think I really appreciate your point, not your question, your criticism, because I jumped completely on them. The point is that, so I moved to the reason why I prefer not to develop them, is that they remain at the circulation. They don't really, they have no theory of value, and they are proud of this, which is something for me is very weak theoretically, to pretend to have a theory, an economic theory, in which you never face the issue of value. This is a really serious problem. But it is sure that there are the economists which gave inspiration to all the new institutionalist economics. When you start reading Williamson, which is one of the most important, very often he mentioned Commons and other old institutionalists, and he pretends to say, like Bose and Gintis did with Marx, but all these new institutionalist economists pretend to say that they are doing the same stuff of Common and Weber and so on, but with more sophisticated tools and more rigorous tools. So I think from this point of view, it's clear that these guys needs a lot of attention. Now, the reason why I don't build any contribution on them is, as I was saying, that they remain on the side of circulation. And they cannot do otherwise, because the fact that theoretically they don't have a theory of value does not allow them to explain exploitation. So all these concepts of exploitation, all these notions that you can understand once you get into the economic sphere, into the sphere of production, are all notions that you approach them on the sphere of circulation, and you end up very close to mainstream economics. So this is the reason why I think I have read them, and I think, for instance, Veblen is very efficacious and very clever in showing lots of issues of power. At the same time, when you want to build on it, what can you do? You can just have implications on the regulating markets, for instance. But you will never develop a revolutionary stance from this, because there is nothing revolutionary here. It's just accepting the capitalist mode of production and saying that there are some power asymmetry that you want to contrast. But at the same time, you don't understand where they come from. Because in the case of antitrust, for instance, I have tried to argue that in Marx's case, the trust is the result of competition. So it is the coercive mechanism of competition that lead capital to concentrate and to centralize and to form trust. Now, the idea of commons is that basically when you see a trust, this is not good. Why? Because he has the Varroasian model in his head, in a sense. Or if it's not Varroas, it's meat. So the idea that if you have competition, things work well. In this case, you have power, so you take profit out of nothing. So this is the problem. But he doesn't see that you take profit out of nothing, even if there is perfect competition. So you start contrasting competition and monopolies exactly in the same way as mainstream economics does. And this, for me, is unacceptable. Not only theoretically, but also politically. You are not understanding what you are fighting against. You see a concentration of capital, you express a value judgment which is negative about this, but it remains a moral critique. There is nothing necessary. You don't understand why capital will in any way concentrate. You can develop all your antitrust in the European Union. One of the basic principles is competition. The law of competition is the principle that led to the establishment of this union. So you have loyal competition. The problem is that the competition is not loyal, or is unfair. So you have all these moral things in order to correct competition when it doesn't work well. And I think that if you want to understand the mechanism of capital, you should understand that competition is not if it works well or not. Competition is the other side of the coin of capital. You have capital as an entity which subjugates the entire society. And how does it do it concretely? By means of competition. So the idea that in order to fight against capital, concentrated capital as an entity, you play on competition is for me very contradictory. And this is also the reason why it doesn't work. The antitrust can be serious as they want, but if something is, if you make more profit by concentrating capital, the law of capital will go in that direction. You cannot, if you have a river, the river goes this, you cannot try to go the other way around. What you can do is try to govern this, but the river will always go from up to down. The problem is if you think that a system in which things goes from up to down is a problem and you want to change it, it's not a question of governing this. It's that anyway you are governing a system of exploitation. And this is the reason why I'm not so interested in finding solution of in the old institutionalist sense. Of course, they can improve a lot in this system, but they will remain subject to all the contradictions of this system. And they are not even understanding that what they are fighting against is exactly because the system has its laws. They don't recognize the laws of this system.
To talk about commons and problem, we have to invite a social democrat, not a Marxist. Okay. More questions? Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you for the very stimulating presentation. There are three core pillars of neoliberalism that I would like to hear from you how Marx deals with them. One is precarious work and all the subject conditions that makes a person think that instead of being an exploited person, worker, he is an entrepreneur. The second one is financialization. Third one, destruction of environment. From a Marxist standpoint, how would you categorize all these three things? These are, I see it, like I said, pillars of advancing neoliberalism, this actual stage of capitalism.
These are very deep questions.
Well,
No, they are really interesting. Caterina, but I'll just want to say that we already running out of time. So I would tell those who feel like they have to go, please feel free to go. It's fine. But in any case, we will try not to get this too late. Okay?
I have no intention to be synthetic on this question.
Yeah, I know you.
The only thing is that my battery is coming down, but I wrote the 3 points.
Yeah, okay, but I will ask you to make an effort. Still, Caterina wants to.
I don't want to ask a question. I wanted to make a comment, short, head on of what you were saying to João about the question of cooperatives, because I think that's, I mean, if we are also talking about Marx, and we are also talking, as you said, as someone who was deeply engaged in the strategic debates of his times. And I think the interesting, a part of the interesting, and I don't have anything to say more to what you said about the question of cooperatives, but I think there's an extra debate to it, which was a debate about strategy in the SPD, which had to do, and it's a debate about in the SPD in Germany, in the Social Democratic Party, which had to do with the question of where does the party put its strategic focal points. And there was a big debate between, there was a strategic opinion led by Ferdinand Lassalle, who defended the idea of the iron law of wages, that because he understood the general theory of wages, he was debating with Marx about the general theory of wages, and he defended the idea of the iron law of wages, and therefore wages would always it would always approach a minimum of subsistency, that therefore there was no point on leading trade union struggles. So he was actually an SPD member, legal member, who defended as a strategical focal point the creation of cooperatives and the strategic struggles on the state, so what we a lot of times call the political struggles, leaving aside the question of the organized working class. And I think a part of Marx's debate about cooperatives was also because he was engaged in this strategic debate, which was not only strategic, but was coming from an understanding of his theory on wages, and about the debate on the immiseration and the pauperization of the proletariat, and of whether it's relative or absolute. And I think that's a really big, also really big debate that actually influenced strategy, and why this was also something that Marx was engaged in.
Okay, just to make sure, we will not have an end to this discussion tonight. Okay. So Caterina said she was going to make a comment, and I will suggest that you, for the time being, you swallow this comment. And Caterina will be, and many of the people in the room will be in the workshop during the weekend, and I'm sure this type of question will arise then, because you will go deep in Das Kapital. And I would suggest.
You don't need all these words. You exercise power over me. I'm not doing this, guys.
Come on. So I would suggest you answer. Yeah, right?
This is a very authoritative way of exercising power over the invited guy. Anyway, I accept it because in this case you have power. We will see outside of this university.
Just outside the room in 5 minutes.
No, I try to, you raised three important points. Each of them has its autonomy and its relevance in political struggles and in the way we could change the world. And all the three of them are basically an expression of the mystification of the system. So the first one, as you said, we are the entrepreneur of ourselves. This is the most sophisticated bullshit of vulgar economics, but it is exactly what it is. So this is, once again, it is vulgar economics, it's just the appearance, but it's not false, it is true. If you don't manage yourself, you don't sell well your labor power, you are fucked. So this is a way in which the class relationships are so strong against labor that even ideologically we can develop these things and no labor movement says, fuck off, it's not like this, we will organize and fight against you. So once the labor movement is individualized, so you are not a class, you are not subjectively, you are not a social class. Of course, even ideologically, they can develop this kind of vulgar theories on the representation of you, which will contribute to the individualization process. So this is once again one of the step backwards that the labor movement has done in the last decades. Another aspect is the role of the financial system, which is something again that is a product of the mystification of this system. And the bourgeois economist and the Marxist economist, which is more bourgeois than his enemies, remains trapped in the mystification of this system. This comes from, it's very clear when you read Marx on the role of the rate of interest. Basically, Marx is arguing that the rate of interest is just a piece of profit. So we have the rate of profit with all its dynamics. The rate of interest is something different. It's something that has no real law. It's not like the rate of profit. It depends on supply and demand. And at some point, when you have this huge concentration of capital with stock companies, which becomes so important, with the public debt of the state, which becomes so important, you have the impression that you just lend money and you have the right to a rate of interest, so to a piece of the rate of profit. The problem is that if you give money to the state, or you give money to a firm or to a consumer which is just using this money to produce, to buy goods, not to produce new goods, you are not producing any surplus value, you are not producing any new value. So you are just helping the realization of the value that has been produced. And this gives rise to the impression that the rate of interest is independent, is autonomous. So the rate of interest is the real compensation for the property right you have. You have money and you pretend that money becomes more money. In capitalism, this mechanism goes through production. In production, you exploit workers, and this surplus value can be divided into the entrepreneur, the wage of the entrepreneur, and part is for the rate of interest. Once you have this huge system, which capitalism has developed a lot, so you think that money can create more, can give rise to more money. The fact itself that I lend money to him just to buy a house, but he's not producing any money because he's buying a house where he has to live. I think that I have the right to this rate of interest. So you start, not you, all of us start to look at the juxtaposition, not capitalists against workers, but the rate of interest is something autonomous. It's just the financial compensation of property. And at the same time, the capitalist, the entrepreneur, which is on the workplace exploiting you concretely, appears as a worker. He says, but basically I'm a worker myself. I wake up in the morning like you. Then it's true that you work and very hard work, and it's just looking at you if you're not giving the maximum. But he's there. So we have this impression that the worker is exploited not by the capitalist class, but by a piece of the capitalist class, which is the financial market, the financial system. On the other hand, you have this kind of transforming into heroes the general exploiters, the person that lead the company becomes like workers. So you have this juxtaposition of real economy and financial economy. So the real economy is good because we are producing. Work together, workers and capitalists. We are participating to production, so we are doing something good. You are giving me a job. So in this case, you are doing a noble function. What the banks does? Nothing. The banks just give money and pretends more money, even when this money is not transformed into surplus value and more profit. So you have this impression that the financialization is the problem, because you have let this parasite system expanding too much. So they pretend more and more compensation, and this forces the productive system to be more and more exploited. And in this juxtaposition, you are just arbitrarily dividing the capitalist class in two. One part appears as part of the working class, and the other part appears as autonomous, and so with a value judgment which becomes negative. So even the left-wing Democrat says, oh no, this is a problem of finance. Money must go in the real system, in the real production system. As if in the real production system there was no exploitation, but anyway, the work of the workers has to remunerate both the pieces of capitalism. And when the third question of environment, even this is once again, we can look at all the byproducts of capitalist exploitation. One is the fact that they are destroying this planet will not survive under capitalist conditions. At the same time, we are transforming animals into machines of profits. We are transforming human relationships just in order to get more profit. And very often when you don't have a scientific critique, all you can do is starting from your moral. And this is very dangerous because morality is never universal. Morality is always a product of the society in which you live in and the role you play in this society. So the problem of environment is not that we see the environment as a commodity. A commodity if I produce a commodity and I can take profit, and at the same time I'm destroying the environment, but I have not to pay anything. Of course, I will choose the technology which destroys the environment. So one day we wake up and say, oh, look, the environment is fine, we should do something. But we don't understand that this is just a byproduct of the fact that we are producing capitalistically. If you try to contrast this with a system in which you are producing for social goods, for the goods of the people, you will never produce something which is good when you go to school, but at the same time you are polluting the place where you live. This does not correspond to your need. So you already internalize all this. But the capitalist system is not a system which you internalize anything. The only things that matter is individual profit. So competition forces every producer, every capitalist to look for the maximum of its profits. And this is the reason why if you have to transform cows and chicken into machines for making money, you just don't care. If you have to transform the environment into a commodity which will never survive some centuries more, you just don't care. This is why Marx uses the expression après moi le déluge. After me the I don't know how to say it. After me the end of the story. But the reason why I think your question is very intriguous is that these are the the starting point of the political debate. We discuss about this because this is the way problems are posed in our society. So we don't have a faced of the contradictions of capitalism. We don't try to develop an anti-capitalist strategy. We try to take every single point and say, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like that, and you don't understand that they have a common cause. So even the answer that she does, for instance, in the case of pollution, I think this is the very genial idea they had, like neoclassical economists. They say, okay, the problem is that you are producing too much because capitalist is a commodified system. That's perfect. Let's treat environment as a commodity. So you have the rights, and you have a market in which you buy and sell the right to pollution. And in a way, this is just if you go back to the scheme I had. You are in the part in which there is the imperfect decision-making context. You make a market. So in this market, if there is competition, everybody will buy and sell the right to pollute, and you will have the right degree of pollution in this world. Of course, if this is right according to the capability of this system to reproduce itself, is all another question. But economically, we have solved the problem by inventing a new market. So faced with the problem of commodification, what is the answer? Make new markets. And this is why I think there is no way to answer your three questions within the bourgeois feeling about these three problems. The only way out is to understand that these are just consequences of the commodification of labor power. Once you have commodified the human relationship, why you are so astonished if you commodify animals, plants, and viruses and whatever. So I think this is a problem of the tendency to mystify everything, and it is something you cannot do much against, because this is a system based on mystification. What we have to do is to make a scientific critique of this, but the scientific critique of this means to make a scientific critique of capital.
Okay, I think we have a lot of material here, a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much, Giulio, for these 2 hours. I think that we have today kind of interlude of Marxist thought, picking up on power as basically a nice excuse to start to think, to look at the world in a Marxist way, or at least as a Giulio Palermo's Marxist way of looking at the world, which I think is quite stimulating. I think now we have, if we want to go deeper in this, it's important to go back to the writings, and we will have Giulio with us for a few days. So not only during the weekend, we will have Giulio in the first days of next week. If you are interested in go deeper into some of these topics, I'm sure that you will be happy to interact. So just write me an email, or write him directly an email, which is available in the internet, so it's not difficult to find. Okay, thank you very much, and I will suggest we give an applause to Giulio. Thank you. Amarillo.